All right, everyone. Nice to be back with you again. And let me jump right in. And there's a lot going on in the news, from more extreme weather to inflation to rumblings about what's going to happen in the 2022 elections. The January 6th inquiry continues to move along. There's a lot that we could talk about if we just wanted to focus on the day to day. But as I said a couple of weeks ago, I want to actually change course, and I think we'll stay on this course probably for the rest of this year, which is just a few lectures. And what I've been doing for the last couple of weeks, and I'll continue to do today, is to be bifocal, if you will, about American politics, to focus not only on the short term, which is the stuff I was just mentioning, and which frankly can often look quite grim or dismal. It does look like we are in for a long period of political polarization, fractiousness, disagreement, and even erosion for support of democratic norms that I think is a genuine threat to American democracy. But I think simultaneously, and I can't emphasize enough that this is the way in which we need to change our perspective and see things that are occurring at exactly the same time. There are signs of hope on the ground, already taking shape, already transforming aspects of American politics that have to do with long-term demographic changes in the United States, with the emergence of a new political agenda, new political will, new political coalitions as well, and that we would be well served to pay attention to these trends, not only because it gives us a little solace, a little sense that although the next decade may be bleak, it may very well pave the way for a better period in American politics, but also because appreciating the sources for political hope allows us to actually figure out where to concentrate our energies, what we should be promoting or sustaining or contributing to, either through our check writing or through our activism. And so that is the overall project of these lectures. And today I'm going to do my best to get to the second of the two authors that I'm drawing on in these lectures. And just very briefly to refresh your memory, Heather McGhee, the former head of the public interest research group Demos, who spent a couple years traveling across the United States looking for evidence of successful multiracial political coalition building and the benefits it delivers at primarily the local and also the regional level. In her book, The Sum of Us, she delivers the report from her long trip, and I think convincingly suggests, whether we're talking about Richmond, California, or Lewiston, Maine, or Atlanta, Georgia, or a dozen other communities, that multiracial democratic projects are afoot in the United States, and that they are already delivering goods for the people who participate them, and that the basic claim here is that when we leave behind the competitive politics of racial status hierarchy thinking, either our group is on top or your group is on top, and instead engage in cooperation, we all benefit, and the benefits exceed whatever costs there may be to surrendering whatever status advantage you secure through competition. And then the second book is by Robert Putnam, a very well-known, regarded political scientist, the former dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard University. His book is called The Upswing, and it is a long history of American politics from the 1890s through the 2020s. He describes it as a 125-year period. And his suggestion is that rather than focusing on the second half of that period, the 60 years or 70 years from the middle of the 20th century to the present, which looks primarily to be a period of decline, moving away from equality, moving away from bipartisan cooperation, moving away from robust participation in associational life, moving away from a culture that emphasized other regarding projects and into greater inequality, greater polarization, greater individualism, greater competition and selfishness. We should pay attention to the first half of the curve and how we moved out of a period that looks actually, in most respects, uncannily like contemporary American politics, society, and culture into the better period of the middle of the 20th century in order to determine if we might be able to do it again, or even better, if perhaps without recognizing it, we might already be beginning an upswing. And we bring these two together. Heather McGhee provides us some promising evidence that at least the seeds for a new upswing are being planted at the local level. And Putnam reminds us that the initiatives of the progressive era that eventually took root and grew to the New Deal and the period that so many historians laud in the middle of the 20th century, that those seeds were planted at the local level in the progressive era in the 1890s, the first couple decades of the 20th century as well. And so maybe if we concentrate on building on what is succeeding at the local level in 2020, we might bear the fruits in 2050 or so in terms of a new and better era in American politics. All right, so with that general refresher in hand, let me note where we left off last week. And I suggested, in a sense, that there was a fork in the road in American politics. Two models as we become a clearly and firmly multiracial society. One model is building on that demographic change to create new political coalitions and a new model of democracy, a model of multiracial cooperation. The other model concerns the effort to continue to maintain white status superiority. Whites remain the majority group in our society, just barely, but still the majority. They obviously remain the largest racial ethnic group in our society, and they have enjoyed by far and away the highest social status, as well as the greatest income and wealth of any racial group in our society's history. And at this historical moment, it appears that primarily one political party is taking the path of trying to maintain white status superiority. You will have guessed that that is the Republican Party. And another party is primarily down the path of trying to build a multiracial political coalition and engaging in cooperation to make our society more equal, more cooperative, and to build a more robust system for the provision of public goods in our society. And so these two models map onto two parties. They also map onto two visions of society. And I want to suggest that there are high collective costs of the non-cooperative model, of the status maintenance model. And those costs are not only in terms of the anemic provision of public goods in the United States compared with almost every other developed society. And we could look at healthcare, we could look at public education, we could look at housing, we could look at infrastructure across the board. As McGee puts it at one point, other societies have more nice things than the United States has because we have a more competitive model of politics, and we are competing rather than cooperating in an effort to uh, determine who comes out on top, as opposed to finding ways for all of us to work together. The metaphor that McGee uses and returns to at several points in her book is that of public swimming pools that were dismantled rather than being desegregated or integrated. And I suggested to you that one way to think about this is how much support for expanding the federal government we find as people become more vulnerable economically. And that this is actually a very weak correlation. You would think that the people who stood to benefit more from the expansion of the federal government would be more supportive of it. But in fact, they're very modest in their increased support. Whereas as we go up the scale of ethnic antagonism, racial hostility, we find dramatically decreased support for increasing federal government expenditures. And McGee's suggestion, I think it's a very powerful, plausible, illuminating idea, is that it is ethnic hostility on the part of those who would be the natural constituents for a more active, better funded, better resourced federal government. It's their belief that supporting federal programs, federal expenditure, federal regulation would result in a more equal society racially, would result in the erosion of white privilege, would perhaps even privilege African Americans and Latinos over whites, the so-called replacement theory that hold that zero-sum thinking has over a large portion of our population that is maintaining this kind of politics and making it politically viable despite the demographic transition that we're in the midst of. The second path is the path of the politics of multiracial cooperation. And I want to suggest that not only does it have clear advantages in terms of the provision of public goods, it also has important psychological benefits, or benefits for the way in which people secure their self-esteem, as opposed to doing it through comparative thinking. Our group is better than your group, which is frankly hard to maintain in light of the evidence. We come together, collaborate, each of us make our contribution, and think of ourselves in more individual, more honest, and frankly, more free ways. So with that basic divide set up, I now want to suggest some of the ways in which this split is playing out. And the idea that this maps onto a partisan split, I think, is borne out in information we've looked at together before, as well as some new information. The first piece of evidence is simply who votes for which party. And as we can see, the Republican Party has rarely cracked more than 10% support from people of color, that 90% plus of the support for the Republican Party still comes from white people, whereas the Democratic Party basically mirrors the demographics of our society. So one of our two parties is already a multiracial coalition. One of them has remained a dominantly white party. And when we look at the breakdown of the support, majority of Americans still support the Democratic Party. It's very close right now. And I think that's worthwhile noting when we think about why the politics of the next decade are likely to be so messy, so fraught, potentially so dangerous. We are split between two radically incompatible views of the future of America, and we're split nearly 50-50, right? And not only that, the fact that these views are so different leads each side to deeply mistrust, not to mention caricature the other side. If we then break this down a little bit more in terms of race and education, and it's that intersection of being white and lacking a four-year college degree that I'm going to suggest again and again has resulted in downward economic mobility, anger, anxiety, and status insecurity. And it's this group of Americans that is really favoring the Republican program of maintaining white status superiority in the United States, whereas white Americans with a college degree are generally speaking doing much better economically, feel much less neglected by the government, much less left out, if you will. They're in a more secure position economically, and that allows them to be more generous politically. And the result is that they are more likely to endorse the Democratic vision of a politics of multiracial collaboration going into the middle of the 21st century. So if the path we pick is path number one, we see some of the consequences right away. Among them is the idea that there's a whole media environment in addition to a major political party that will tell you that the American way of life is deeply threatened by the demographic changes, and that in fact challenges the very legitimacy of equal citizenship and standing for citizens of color. This is reflected most directly in the idea that the election was stolen. The election of 2020 was stolen from Donald Trump. The most recent data suggests that 60% of Republicans believe that the election was stolen, and that a substantial portion of those who believe that the election was stolen believe that violence is justified to reverse the outcome of the election. That's almost 1 in 10 Americans. I think we have to take this with a grain of salt. This is survey data. It may just be signaling support for Donald Trump or signaling agreement with the Fox Diet News world. But having said that, this is an indication, a very strong, very alarming indication, and one of many, of the idea that we allow elections to determine who gets to exercise political power in our society, who our leaders will be, that is being eroded as the demographics of our society are changing, and the principle of one person, one vote increasingly means that a diverse America will elect diverse leaders. And this is then shown in the overlap between this group, the roughly 10% of Americans, the substantial portion of Republicans who say that violence may be justified to overturn the results of what by all accounts was a fair, free, good election in 2020. And they overlap substantially with a group of people who fear that African Americans or Latinos will eventually have more rights in the United States than white people. The so-called Great Replacement theory, which started on the far right margins of our political discourse and has increasingly moved to the mainstream of the Republican political party, the right-wing media ecosystem. And if we drill down a little bit on this and the idea that we've spoken about before, more recent and I think very good survey research. And so while I say we take all surveys with a grain of salt, it's just a snapshot of how a bunch of people answer a question on a phone call, not necessarily as reliable as doing a real interview or even better ethnographic research where we get to know them. At least it gives us some evidence of where public opinion is headed. And when we ask them to respond, do you agree or not with the statement, true American patriots might have to resort to violence in order to save our country, right? Not just overturn the election, save the country. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans reports on this survey that they agree with that statement. And basically 1 in 3 Republicans, right? And now then we break it down. It's only 1 in 10 Democrats, although that in and of itself should be alarming. 30% of Republicans, only 20% of them who watch mainstream news, basically identified with every major television network except Fox. And so that basically mirrors the general opinion of the American people. But when we ask the people who watch Fox, the answer goes up to 32%, 1/3. When we ask about people who watch Breitbart or alt-right media networks, we see 40%, right? And note the very strong overlap again between people who believe that the election was stolen and want to resort to violence, and the very strong overlap with people who believe the country has changed so much they feel like a stranger in their own country. Those people, 30% of them say that violence may be necessary to save America. What I'm about to show you in terms of going a little deeper on this. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had a different slide here. Let me move on and I'll try to come back to that slide in a moment. The people, a second consequence, I'm sorry, of choosing the fork of maintaining white status superiority is eroding support for the right to vote, right? And so a first consequence is increased willingness to believe disinformation if it suggests that your side maintains power, that the candidate you support did not actually lose the election. Increased willingness to embrace force, to change the outcome of an election, or to change the demographic trends in our society. Please note how frightening, how awful the potential consequences of those beliefs are if they become widespread, legitimate, and the basis for action. Closely related to that, but I want to suggest a second consequence of embracing the Republican model of politics in the United States today, model of democracy, is eroded support for the right to vote. And as you can see, right, the Constitution, American culture, a whole string of Supreme Court decisions is clear that the right to vote is a fundamental right of every American citizen, right? The 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution make this absolutely clear. And fortunately, nearly 60% of Americans continue to believe this, but much more alarmingly, 40% no longer believe this and believe instead that voting should be better understood as a privilege, not a right, that can be limited. And please note the partisan split here. It is 2/3 of Republicans who believe this. And please note the implications again is that efforts at limiting access to the ballot, at making it more difficult to vote, at potentially disenfranchising portions of the population that you don't believe have earned this privilege. This is not just responses to a public opinion poll. These are legislative efforts that are underway in states where Republicans hold near exclusive power. Again, we can see this in slightly more refined ways. Who believes that the bigger problem in the United States is that eligible voters are being denied the right to vote, as opposed to who believes that the bigger problem is that ineligible voters are voting. For all Americans, 55% believe that the bigger problem is disenfranchisement, but for Republicans, it's only 16%. And as you can see, again, when we break it down by media, 29% who watch the mainstream news believe the bigger problem is that eligible voters are denied the right to vote as opposed to ineligible voters voting. When we look at Fox News, it's only 9%. When we look at far right news, it's only 1%, right? It's not funny, but it is almost laughable that if you belong to this media ecosystem, your perception of what is happening with American electoral politics is that deeply distorted. Because please note that all of the allegations of systematic fraud in American politics in 2020 or in previous years have been disproved, at least going back the last 40, 50 years. Earlier than that, yes, there has been fraud. And I think it's worthwhile calling it out where it occurs. And the Democrats have benefited from it, and the Republicans have benefited from it, depending upon which era and which election we're talking about. But it is not a systematic problem in contemporary American politics. As a matter of fact, it is so negligible as to be statistically completely insignificant, to have no bearing on any election. And yet, 99% of the people who follow far right news outlets, primarily in the web or on social media, believe that demonstrably false idea. And again, I want to be as clear as possible about this. We are bending reality, bending our perception of reality, engaging in motivated reasoning, engaging in identity conforming cognition in order to support our view of politics. And what we can see, right, is that there are efforts underway to restrict access to the ballots, to make it more difficult to, for instance, vote in urban areas by reducing the number of polling stations, to make it more difficult for people without driver's licenses to vote by increasing the voter ID requirements on elections, to make it more difficult to vote early. And these are efforts that it is believed will benefit the party sponsoring them, and that party is dominantly the Republicans. And this is combined with gerrymandering and the redistricting process. And in particular, I think the thing that we need to be paying special attention to is the idea that the process of registering what happens in an election, which has been for most of the 20th century in the aftermath of progressive era reforms, a mainly nonpartisan affair, a very low-key event. Some of the people who are election officials are in fact elected and do run on a party line. But as we saw in 2020 in Georgia and Arizona, These were people who put fidelity to the integrity of the election system above their partisan identity. Well, there is a movement afoot to run highly partisan officials for these positions on the idea that in 2020 the election was stolen from Trump and the Republicans should have stood up for him as opposed to laying down and letting Biden steal the election. That we are about to enter an era in which the very way in which we register the outcome of our elections is likely to be itself much more the subject of partisan contest and potentially partisan manipulation. And so this is a second consequence of taking path one as opposed to path two, is that you begin to instrumentalize democracy itself to make support for democracy conditional on your party prevailing against very strong demographic headwinds. And we can see what happens when the gerrymandering occurs. By the way, I will just add very quickly that it's not at all clear um, that the gerrymandering that is currently occurring will drastically affect the composition of Congress, in part because the gerrymandering of House districts was already so advanced in 2010, there may not be that much room for greater advantage to be secured in 2020. But I've shown you some of this data before. What you can see, for instance, in Pennsylvania is that the Democrats won 50% of the vote for the House. The Republicans won 49. This is in 2012. And yet the Democrats controlled only 5 seats, the Republicans 13. So a complete skewing of the results. We see something similar in North Carolina in 2012. By the way, both the Pennsylvania and North Carolina districting maps were eventually overturned. Something similar in Wisconsin again, right? You know, the split of the state vote is roughly 50-50. The congressional delegation is 2-1 or more in favor of the party that gets the smaller portion of the vote. And please note that this is happening also at the state level, right? So this is Wisconsin assembly districts, right? Where the Republicans are winning the minority of the vote, 48 to 49%, close, right? But a super majority of the assembly delegates. And that, by the way, puts them in position to gerrymander again in the next round, right? So a real instrumentalization of democracy. When we look at what this does, right? And we can see, right, that, and this is looking at, I think, 2010, right? Republicans got more votes than the Democrats, 50% to 49%. But that was then amplified into a very strong advantage in terms of the seats in the House of Representatives, 241 to 194. And so the number of seats that are so-called misrepresented seats, 21 seats that went to the Republicans that should have gone to the Democrats if things were perfectly proportional. And as you can see, both blue states and red states engage in some gerrymandering that gives the party that is dominant an advantage. But the Republicans do this more aggressively and determinedly than do the Democrats. This happens in different ways with the Senate and the Electoral College. Very quickly, right? The Senate is, in a sense, constitutionally gerrymandered so that the less populous states get more votes proportionately when compared to the more populous states. And it just so happens, it's a demographic accident of the United States, that white people and white non-college educated people are more concentrated in the less populous states. So as you can see, white non-college people punch above their weight in terms of their representation in the Senate. White college grads are basically just slightly overrepresented in the Senate. Every other group is underrepresented in the Senate. And this then translates into racial discrepancies in the weight of votes in the electoral college as well, with again, white people overrepresented in terms of their likelihood of their vote to determine the outcome of a presidential election. Black, Hispanic, and other racial groups underrepresented in terms of the likelihood that their vote will impact the outcomes of a presidential election. And what this means then is that as the Republicans continue down the path of withdrawing support for core democratic norms, of trying to gerrymander, trying to politicize the registration of the outcome of elections, trying to make it more difficult to vote, they actually have a viable path for maintaining political power, right? And then resisting the tendency of the overall demographic transformation that the United States is undergoing right now to force them to change their politics. So it's not a politics of trying to maintain white status superiority, but instead a politics of trying to build a multiracial coalition. How can the Republicans remain viable as an almost exclusively white party, despite the demographic changes occurring in our country? I want to suggest a number of factors. The Electoral College, obviously, in ways that I've just shown. The Senate bias against non-metropolitan, non-urban areas, the overrepresentation of less populous states, the way in which the House skews in terms of representation simply through population distribution, right? The majority of Democrats, the majority of diverse Americans are highly concentrated in urban areas. We are, quote, packed in. And that, in a sense, is a kind of self-gerrymandering. It's natural to concentrate us in electoral districts and then make it the case that although we all vote for the same candidate, that 80% vote only gets us one representative, whereas 52% in another less urban district gets Republicans a representative, right? And that's part of then the skew in the demographics, the skew in the voting data that shows that Republicans are overrepresented in the House. There are ways that we could engage in electoral reform to address this, particularly moving to larger multi-member districts. But right now, given our electoral system, population distribution or political geography biases representation in favor of the party that continues the path of maintaining white status superiority. And then, of course, gerrymandering amplifies this. Let me add to this two additional factors. And if you're looking at the political press, the pundits right now, you will see a lot of hand wringing by people who think that the Democratic Party is shooting itself in the foot. There's the quotation from Thomas Jefferson that bold programs should not be launched on the basis of slender majorities. And there's a worry that the Democratic Party is overextending its very slender majority position in Congress to embrace positions that are unpopular with large portions of the voters that the Democrats need to win. And I would, I think, want to modify that. I don't actually think that that is fully accurate. What I would say is an issue here is that the Democratic Party is a broad coalition right now. And it's certainly has people in it like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who take positions that are inflammatory, right? That are out there in terms of contemporary American politics, and that is what they were elected to do by their progressive constituents in Brooklyn and the Bronx, right? So they do advocate for positions that alienate non-college educated voters. But I have to say, that doesn't mean that this is the dominant position of the Democratic Party or that this is the policy agenda being pursued by the Democratic Party. That what I think is really more accurate to say is that the people in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is a growing and sizable wing of the party, and particularly the people on the far left, give fodder to the right-wing media ecosystem who amplifies their positions and suggests to the people who are basically fed a exclusive diet of Fox News that this is the Democratic Party, that they're all socialists, that they've left behind any kind of common sense, that they are contributing to inflation, that they want to take away your rights, et cetera, and so on. Right? And so it might be the case that the Democratic Party is in certain ways giving fodder to the media ecosystem that is driving the move away from the Democratic Party on the part of non-college educated voters. But having said that, I don't think it's accurate to say that the Democratic Party is pursuing a radical political agenda. All right, so third main consequence of going down the first fork of the two forks that are present in American politics today, and that is that many voters, especially this critical group, whites with less than a college degree, are damaging their material interests, including their life expectancy, in order to try to maintain their status superiority. And we've looked at this in various ways together, that this is not irrational. It is self-destructive in a material sense. But many people that we consider admirable think there are things more important than protecting your material interests. The problem is with the fact that the priority is placed on maintaining racial status superiority. So how does this work? The evidence from Case and Deaton's deaths of despair, from Jonathan Metzl's dying of whiteness, is quite clear. White people are seeing their mortality increase, their life expectancy decrease. This is dragging down things for America as a whole. You can see here, right, that after deaths per 100,000 declining continuously for white Americans in the last third of the 20th century, it actually increased, right? The deaths per 100,000, life expectancy decreased in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. This did not happen to Black Americans. And as I've said to you before, Jonathan Metzl helps us to understand some of this in terms of the laws that white people without college degrees and the Republican elected officials that they are putting in office support. Gun liberalization laws, where the guns end up being used in suicides or domestic disputes. And please note that deaths of despair refer to suicides, drug overdoses, alcohol-related deaths, right? And so guns are extremely important in this. The refusal to expand Medicaid or to accept federal aid under the Affordable Care Act. decreasing life expectancy in the states that have refused to do that. The cutting of federal and state support for housing, for food, etc. That this is all part then of the scenario of what I would refer to as white America's self-injuring politics, at least conservative white America, and the way in which it's being implemented by the Republican Party. What this diagram shows you is that from 1970 to 2010, the percentage of personal income for individuals in Kentucky, right? This is what allows people to pay their bills, put food on their table, pay their rent, has gone from 10% to 23% coming from federal social benefits. Yet, over precisely that period, right, this same group of people has put more and more conservative politicians in power at the state level, and they have cut those benefits, right? This diagram shows you temporary assistance for needy families, right? Food stamps, we used to call it, and the benefit level is set by the states, and the most conservative states, the Bible Belt, set the levels very low, despite having among the highest rates of poverty in the United States. I think this is quite clear, right? The idea here is that the federal government, and I'm turning now to the next aspect of the distortion of reality, is misperceived as pursuing policies that benefit African Americans, Latinos, recent immigrants over white working class people. And one way to see this is when you do surveys, and this is just an example, how much progress toward racial equality has been made in the United States. And the survey focuses on Black-white racial equality. And I should say surveys, there were 3 surveys done to make sure they got it right. In terms of the benefits that people get from the government, are they equal, right? And the perception is, yes, we've moved a great deal of the way towards equality. The reality is not at all. College education and wage benefits, the perception is that we've moved a great ways towards racial equality. The reality is, in fact, we have backslid over the last 50 years, which is the period this survey looks at. High school educational attainment and wages, again, perceptions of progress, reality of backsliding. Wealth equalization, perceptions of progress, reality of backsliding. Income equalization, very strong perceptions of progress. We're almost to equality, when in fact the reality is much more limited progress. And so there's a kind of willful ignorance, a kind of motivated reasoning going on here, in which we believe that genuine racial progress has been made, and that it has been sponsored by the federal government, that the federal government has been on the side of closing the racial income, wealth, education, and benefit gaps, to the neglect of doing things that would benefit white working class Americans, the people who feel left out, who feel their status being undermined, who feel anxious about belonging in the United States. And so again, what we see is a distorted perception of reality being fed by a media ecosystem, being fed by a major political party, and in so doing, making it appear to many Americans that the idea of engaging in multiracial collaboration and democracy is foreclosed by the other group competing against you, and their competition resulting in your situation being eroded. Very quickly, let me talk for a moment about the consequences of embracing the second model. And here I'll just point to the legislation under consideration in Congress right now, the so-called Build Back Better legislation, and the benefits that it would deliver to Americans who are economically vulnerable, whether white, Black, Latino, Asian, immigrant, or long-standing citizen. Um, $273 billion in childcare, child tax credits that would put $300 in each family's bank account every month, paid leave in order to allow parents to spend time with their young children, universal preschool, healthcare expansion, expansion for housing, right? These are targeted to benefit those Americans who have not done as well with the transition to a post-industrial service and information economy. And there is Jefferson's paradox of forcing great innovations on slender majorities. The hope behind this is that in showing that the federal government really does work for all of us, it would generate a so-called policy feedback loop in which people who start out being opposed to these policies, once they start to benefit from them, actually begin to support them. And that would do two things. On the one hand, it might increase support for the Democrats, but on the other hand, as we've seen with the Affordable Care Act, it might make it impossible for the Republicans to actually oppose these initiatives by repealing them, right? And that in turn, one hopes, might begin the process of intra-party transformation that has to occur for the Republican Party to become, like the Democrats, a genuinely multiracial coalition party, as opposed to pursuing the politics of maintaining white status superiority. And I want to conclude today by suggesting that part of the reason the Democrats have become better at pursuing politics that benefit the bottom 60% of American society, including white working class, white rural, white unemployed, white poor people, is precisely because of the fact that the Democratic Party has become already a multiracial coalition, and that the kind of politics that Heather McGhee finds at the local level in Maine and Georgia and California in specific municipalities and towns is in fact already bubbling up at the national level. I'm not suggesting that it's a slam dunk that this legislation will pass. It may very well not pass. I'm not suggesting that the Democrats will win in 2022. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that they could. I happen to think that we've got a year and a lot can happen in a year. But having said that, it's entirely possible this legislation will fail. The Democrats will lose Congress. The Republicans will regain the presidency in 2024. We are in the short term in a very unstable and very dangerous moment in American politics. But in the long term, Congress will continue to look more like America, and the kinds of policy that will be possible will be transformed as a result. That's my effort to peer into the crystal ball of the future of the United States. Having said all of that, this depends, of course, on our ability to preserve democracy for the next decade. And I don't think that that should be taken for granted. We are in a battle right now to preserve democracy against one party that is increasingly eroding support for it. I'll stop there. I imagine there might be a question or two. Who wants to start us out? Bob, I'm sorry, John, go ahead. I'm thinking of Robert Putnam because I didn't say a word about him. Go ahead, John.
I'd never been confused with Bob Putnam before, although I used to be a good friend. It just occurs to me that Republicans look at voting trends and think they've got a pretty good chance of enlarging, particularly the Hispanic vote, and to some extent the African-American vote, although that may be illusory. But among Hispanics, they probably have quite a lot in their platform that a lot of Latin American or Spanish-speaking Americans go for.
Yeah, and we of course have to disaggregate that group, right? You know, and so there are Mexican Americans, there are Cuban Americans, et cetera, right? And so different groups and different geographies, right? What's happening in southern Texas or southern Florida may be different from what's happening in Arizona. And then let's not forget that ethnic antagonism, which seems to be one of the major predictors of support for at least the Trump iteration of the Republican Party right now, is not exclusively a white phenomenon, right? There are African Americans who really don't like Latino immigration to the United States and who ended up voting for Trump as a result. There are Latinos who want the United States to stay a Christian country and are really worried about Islamic terrorism, at least so they say, right? And so yes, I believe basically that there's the chance for the Republican Party to move above 10%, which is their current high water mark in terms of support from non-white voters. I don't think there's any chance, if it maintains its current policy platform, for it to get anywhere close to where the Democrats are, which is getting 40-45% of their support from people who are not white, right? And so, yes, maybe the Republican Party increases by 50%. That would be dramatic. Its support from people of color. It's still an 85% white party. And frankly, it doesn't win elections in which people who want to maintain white status superiority don't vote. Right, that's the Trump catnip, the electoral catnip that the Republican Party can't walk away from right now. And I do think long term, it's an electoral dead end, even if short term, it is potentially a path to victory, especially if you continue to gerrymander, if you continue to suppress the vote, and if you figure out ways to actually put your finger on the scale of how the vote is counted. So yes, I agree, but I don't think it's dramatic, the ability of the Republican Party. Final thing to say here: how long? I tried to show some evidence, not only today, that white people who vote to maintain their status superiority, in so doing, damage their material position in society, their life expectancy, programs that would benefit them, communal resources that assist in transitioning into a new economic and demographic reality. How long do people continue voting against their material interests in order to shore up their status interest? Is that a stable political future for the Republican Party? And I am, I guess, really asking that question. I'm agnostic at the moment, but I hope, as an article of democratic faith, that at some point people come to their senses a little bit. And so it's not just, can the Republican Party build out a little bit their support from Latinos or African Americans or Asians, it's also, can they continue to garner support for policies that have skewed the distribution of income and wealth, that have generated so much vulnerability for so many people, that dismantle the social safety net that might catch them as a result of economic vulnerability. right? I don't know, but I gotta hope that trend is not sustainable. Wilma, you've got your hand up. You'll have to unmute yourself, okay? There you go.
Yeah, there are two things. One is in the 20th century, we had World War II, and that accounted for unifying the country in ways it hadn't been before and keeping things more egalitarian. I don't want to predict war in this century, but I don't know how things might have changed or if they would have changed without that factor. The other thing is there's a tremendous underfunding of education in this country, and we're seeing the results in profound ignorance and inability to think critically of so many Americans. Yeah, it doesn't look pretty. It just doesn't look pretty to me at all.
Yeah, and so thank you, Wilma. And in a sense, I'll try to remember to return to the first part of your question when we get together next week and start talking about Robert Putnam, because I think Putnam would agree with you about the incredible importance of war and the Depression, right? Two traumatic events that in a sense unified us in the first third of the 20th century and then made the middle third of the 20th century very different. But in addition to that, Putnam suggests we really have to pay attention to the progressive era political developments and how we reacted to the Great Depression and the World Wars was not determined in advance, right? You know, Germany went down a very different route than the United States went down in reacting to the Great Depression. And so the fact that the progressive movement had laid the groundwork for an activist, liberal, welfarist, democratic response helped us to move in the direction we moved in the middle of the 20th century.
But that was quashed totally with McCarthyism and everything that came since then.
And it's funny, I anticipated you were going to say Reagan. You went back even earlier. I'm not sure McCarthy quashed it, but yes, it's a complicated story. Let's come back to that, like I said, next week. Let me focus for a second on education. And by the way, Putnam's story about education is that it's perhaps the single most important factor in explaining the equalization of income and wages in the middle of the 20th century is the very aggressive policies pursued in the first quarter of the 20th century in creating public high school, and the middle of the 20th century in creating the state university systems and public access to higher education. But let me add to that, I don't think it's education alone that accounts for not the failure of the US to manage the transition to a post-industrial economy. That has a lot to do with education and the fact that those who don't have a college degree are left out. But I think you were saying our susceptibility to mis and disinformation, to just believing stuff that isn't true, has a lot to do with the failure of our education system. And I think you need a double-barreled explanation for that. It's not just the failure of the education system, it's also the evolution of the media system. And the fact that what used to be cranky, kooky perspectives that got very little attention in the mainstream media, all of a sudden there's an entire media system built around amplifying those views so long as they get people to pay attention and to keep their eyes on the screens, which are now ubiquitous, walking around with us wherever we go. So we need better education for a variety of reasons. We also need to figure out what we can do about the rapid circulation of disinformation in the 21st century media system. Bob?
Yes, sir. I was just referring back to the Depression and the Second World War and how that brought us together with common cause. I think of the pandemic and the climate change issues capable of doing the same thing, but they do not seem to be working out that way. They seem to be almost more divisive than they are bringing us together.
Yeah, and part of the issue there is the experience of World War II. Let's focus on that for a moment, right? Drew people from all over the country, and here I'm speaking primarily of men, into the same organization, put them next to each other, cheek by jowl, and put them in harm's way, where if they worked together, they might actually survive. Whereas if they didn't work together, they were at much greater risk of death, right? And nothing about either the pandemic or climate change has done that to us. And please note, with these terrible tornadoes that have caused all this destruction in Kentucky and Illinois overnight, you're right, we're seeing yet more evidence of how our negligence of climate change issues is really beginning to wreak havoc in terms of extreme weather. But it happens in one region at one time. It doesn't happen uniformly to all of us, and it doesn't pull us together in terms of the actual organizational implications, right? Whereas World War II did that. But having said that, I think the pandemic and the Great Depression, that's more closely analogous in terms of external factor threatening all of us equally, or at least, quite equally. And you've probably seen the various cartoons and memes indicating that, if this is the way we reacted to polio would still be stalking us today, right? That we just are much more fragmented today. And so, yes, events potentially bring us together, but this is Putnam's claim again. We came together in face of the Great Depression, in the face of the Nazi aggression in Europe and the Japanese aggression at Pearl Harbor, in part because we had already been coming together for 20 or 30 years. And he points out to the presidential elections of 1912, in which you had 3 presidential candidates all vying to be the most progressive, right? They weren't fragmented, they were coming together and trying to occupy the same territory, right? And he indicates, look, that's a good indication of the way in which we were coming together already before the Great Depression and World War II brought us together. You might say we were coming apart already before we encountered the pandemic of 2020, 2021, before climate change started to really impact us concretely in our day-to-day life. And so we're incapable of uniting to combat these dangerous, potentially existential threats. And that may doom us, that may prevent us from effectively responding. Climate change, I'm confident we'll get through the pandemic. It is taking us longer. We're much less effective than we should be. It is costing us economically, psychologically, in terms of mortality, much more than it should. I'm not as confident that we will succeed in meeting the challenge of climate change. All right, everybody, we're well over time. It's great to be back with you in person for the entire session. I look forward to more of the same next week. And then I think the week after that, we take a break for Christmas. And then the week after that, back together again. Take care and more to come. Nice being with you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Mhm.